And so today I'm not actually going to spend a ton of my time talking about like the current state of Kernza production and markets and prices and products. There's some about that. But a lot of that information is available from the people in this room sitting right next to you, or now available online at Kernza.org. Since this is a smaller community of primarily researchers and core partners, I wanted to try to articulate a little better what it is our team does in the commercialization and stewardship group, and think through a little more how do we relate to the research community and to all the partners out in the world to form that bridge. So I'll talk about that and then provide a couple comments. Let's do this. About what we've been up to since 2019, since this core commercialization and stewardship group was hired. So the guiding questions for today are what are some helpful concepts to frame the adoption and scaling of perennial grains, and also just the adoption and scaling of novel solutions for societal challenges. We're gonna have some framing concepts for that. The role of the commercialization and stewardship group in that process. What have we been up to? And then we'll get into the Kernza Stewards Alliance. Okay, so just as a thought experiment, I kind of went into this presentation asking myself, you know, if we all disappeared a year before the commercial launch of our next perennial grain endeavor, what kind of story and playbook would we leave behind? You know, if a new commercialization and stewardship group came around, how would we onboard them, right? What kinds of ideas would we provide? And so I'm going to share a few of those. So just a few conceptual footholds that we'll review include a little bit of a foray into rural sociology, discussion of technology transfer and adoption, and a number of the other concepts you see here we're going to briefly review, and then talk about how those are taking shape a little bit in the Kernza world. So the first is just really at the outset to discuss and name that commercializing and scaling perennial grains is really as much or more social and cultural as it is technological. And in the background, it's kind of faded, but you see Luke Peterson leading us all to the soil health, regenerative agriculture, land ethic. But this is a little figure comes out of a paper about the developing soil health and regenerative agricultural land ethic that is you know, growing and widespread, but still kind of insurgent across the rural landscape. And so this is just a name that perennial grains really in their course of making their way into the world need to bridge and navigate and influence multiple worldviews in the process. And that this work is very social, it's very community-based as we also develop new agronomic systems and technological, you know, ways to get these grains to market. Okay, so launching a new crop. This is a classic technology transfer and adoption challenge. Anybody heard of this little group called Extension? All right, so here pictured is Connie Carlson living out the mission of the Land Grant University and Extension. Connie does that almost better than anyone else I know, so thanks, Connie. We all know that extension is not a one-way street. Technology adoption, especially in agriculture, it is clearly a two or multi-directional intersection between a lot of different actors. And we know that adoption of a new crop, but also any new major technology, is phased with different stakeholder groups. And this can often be broken down into this idea of you have the innovator crowd, you have the early adopters, you have the early majority, the late majority, and the folks that just are never going to change. And this is often correlated to expectations and discussion in the media and in different communities. I read in one article the cycle of, peak of inflated expectations and the trough of disillusionment, leading to the slope of enlightenment. And so, you know, as we proceed through a lot of our conversations, I now kind of catalog in my head, like, oh, this is a peak of inflated conversation. How do I need to navigate that, right? Oh, this is a very pessimistic trough of disillusionment conversation. And so, but the important thing to note here is that inflating, deflating, and equilibrating expectations and visibility of any new major technology is really a natural part of this process. We can try to condense that curve, but this kind of arc and the different needs, interests, and perspective of those stakeholder groups, we need to be aware of, right? So next kind of concept here is that that of sustainability transitions. What is a sustainability transition? So sustainability transition is a long-term, multidimensional, and fundamental transformation process through which established socio-technical systems shift to more sustainable modes of production and consumption. So this is when a major sector of the economy realizes that the basic structure of its technologies and how it operates in the world is not sustainable. That doesn't mean it needs to go away. It means it needs to change, right? And so off-cited example of this is like the transition to renewable energy, right? So I believe that we're doing, in many ways, a similar transition in our work in the Upper Midwest toward continuous living cover, the development of a suite of new technologies that can be profitable while also addressing major sustainability, climate, water, soil challenges. And so a socio-technical system, which some people extend to a socio-economic, institutional, cultural system, is this idea that a crop does not just sit alone in a field, right? You can't just take corn out, put something else in. It's attached to a whole system, an array of infrastructure and business models and grower familiarity and expectations. And so the idea is that as we launch these new technologies, they are linked to and require the development of alternative or adapted technical systems as we move forward in these sustainability transitions. Everybody with me? Cool. Okay, so sorry, this is a little faded, but this is one theory that's out there called multi-level perspective, which is how does that happen? How do sustainability transitions happen? And some researchers for a number of years have identified 3 common levels that they discuss as the landscape, which is really markets, climate, things that might feel like they're beyond our control a little bit, right? Broad scale demographic transitions, the globalization process, right? And then you have regimes or systems that are those socio-technical systems. They kind of are self-reinforcing. The crops feed the markets feed the buyers, the science backs up the system, the investors invest in that system, and it's quite oftentimes hard to break, right? So these are often called path-dependent systems. And what multi-level perspective suggests is that there's always at any given time this floating series of niche or niche solutions out there trying to make headway into those regimes, right? Oftentimes it's this convergence of downward pressure from the landscape level and also a viable alternative niche strategy. The convergence of that upward and downward pressure allows kind of an inroad into that system. And I really believe that that's a little bit what's happening here with perennial grains and a number of the other, with Kernza, perennial grains, and the continuous living cover crops we're developing. So this is kind of a stylized look at that. And you know, a lot of these figures are kind of abstract, but hopefully you can situate Kernza within these kind of broad images, but this is just a stylized visual of that multi-level perspective for the food and agricultural sector that just shows there's like a whole solar system or universe and multiple steps in that system that need to be navigated. So within this process of those niche solutions making their way upward, they need to go through this commercialization process. So this wild ride of a exciting but terrifying curve is where Tessa and I and Connie and a few others live. We've set up a little house there to support people moving across through that process. And so really a lot of what you've heard at the Kernza meeting so far focuses, rightly so, on the research and development process. When these crops begin to leave that research and development process, it's a whole other ballgame, right? And that's kind of where we come into play and create these back loops between the research community and everybody that's trying to pick up, run with, take on risk, and make these things go in the world. And this is often called the valley of death, you know, where everybody takes on risk, tries to work their way out of it, right? So they march down in, they get invested, they plant this crop, they form a business around it, and then their goal is to work their way towards success with that endeavor. And we are there to support that process. And also specifically commercialization is a kind of specific phase. Like hopefully soon we'll be able to say Kernza is commercialized. The question is it commercially successful? Are we doing that with integrity? Is it scaling at the pace we need to? But it's really that process of bringing a new product or service to market. And that's where we sit. So within that process, you have these things called intermediaries. And hopefully that doesn't just mean middlemen or middle people. We have a function in this role. And so I'm suggesting that our serve is intermediaries in these transition process. Here's a quote on the definition of what a transition intermediary is. Actors and platforms that positively influence sustainability transition processes by linking actors and activities and their related skills and resources, or by connecting transition visions and demands of networks and actors with these existing regimes in order to create momentum for change, to create new collaborations within and across these technologies, ideas, and markets, and disrupt dominant, unsustainable systems, configurations. That's what our team is doing. It turns out that there's different types of intermediaries. And so in this community, if you look at this last slide, this is a map of, I think, in the energy efficient housing sector, of all the intermediaries that are involved. And these aren't growers. These aren't businesses. They're not buyers or CPGs. They're facilitators of that process. And so you can see it can get quite intermediarily thick, right? And it turns out folks who have kind of created a typology to understand, well, what are the relative strengths of, say, a land-grant university versus a land institute, relative to a AURI, relative to a community nonprofit, right? And so there's kind of relative strengths and drawbacks and limitations to what each of those entities are positioned to do in this process. And I think we could start to understand ourselves a little bit better if we kind of looked at that typology and tried to situate ourselves within it. Okay, the next concept here is that of an innovation system. Innovation system are interlinked sets of people, processes, assets, and social institutions that enable the introduction and scaling of new ideas, products, services, and solutions capable of facilitating impact. And the kind of nested Russian doll analogy is not new to anyone, but in this case, what you have is kind of layers of participation in these innovation networks that are kind of bucketed out by varying exposure to risk and protection and risk. And so I make the analogy in this case to like raising children. Like they take shape and get their legs under them in a very protected environment, right? But raising them to function and continually exposing them to more risk, right? And that's essentially what we're doing with these major innovations that we're creating, relatively protected spaces for them to take shape, and then moving those out into the world through pilot projects, through, regional initiatives, through policy, incentivized, areas. And then at the outermost layer, this livelihood system is really, the point at which growers and businesses are just buying and selling and growing Kernza or other perennial grains. That's when we kind of know we've gotten out of that process. Everybody still with me? Okay, so innovation, right? Everybody loves that word. Probably annoys many of us. I think concept around innovation is, it's much promoted, but it's not well understood and it needs support. And I'd like to feature here a campaign that was run by our friends at Perennial Pantry. Could you guys raise your hands? So these guys, I think, are innovators. They're entrepreneurs. Are y'all aware of the cracker campaign they've been running? So I'm just gonna let a couple of these run in the background here. But you guys know Joseph Schumpeter, the creative destruction guy? Anyone know who that is? All right, so the early 20th century wrote about this concept of creative destruction and innovation. He's very, very interested in the ways in which entrepreneurs have a key role in major transformation in society. So it's not just labor and capital and investment, it's ideas and bringing them to market, right? And so there's just a quote here that really clarifies that I think we need to think a little bit more about this difference between invention and innovation. This quote here suggests that innovation is really the point at which an invention finds footing in the world, whether it's on a farm or in a product or in a processing facility. The meaningful space in which technical change in society needs to be studied is really that of innovation, where these technologies converge with the economy and the socio-institutional context. And that's really what I think this campaign is doing, multiple things at the same time. And hopefully we're all seeing that. They're not just making a cracker, they're sharing it with us in a different way. They're inviting us into the process. They're inviting us into the development of a product along with the business. And they're thinking about, essentially they're trying to create a relationally based perennial grain economy and asking us to join them, right? So I think that's pretty interesting. So that's really multi-layered innovation strategy. And we know that these innovators and entrepreneurs need support. So I'm just going to talk about that here for a little bit. I think our regional efforts in the upper Midwest have gotten a little thick on the intermediaries and a little support for entrepreneurs. If any of that invention succeeds, we're going to have a lot of new businesses and entrepreneurs on our hands, right? And so there comes a time where we need to think about how to shift or expand the realm of resources we're making available to these folks that are trying to make perennial grains grow and go in the world. And so I'd like to profile just for a moment, we have underway what was kind of alluded to in the Star Tribune yesterday, or named directly, was a continuous living cover value chain development bill that has been developed intentionally to invest directly in perennial grain and continuous living cover entrepreneurs. And here's how we went about doing that. The guys at, to mention Perennial Pantry again, they're kind of critical entity in this little section. We wrote a concept paper about the ways in which state government could more directly support the advancement of continuous living cover beyond the farm gate and in society beyond the laboratory and research fields. We presented them 6 or 7 ideas. We pulled some legislators into their facility. They asked me for some details, and they turned those details into a $10 million bill. And that bill was introduced in the Minnesota House and Senate as bipartisan, bicameral leadership to invest in post-farm gate value chain development for Kernza perennial grain, elderberries, hazelnuts, and winter camelina as 4 leading edge crops. We built a coalition of entrepreneurs and organizations spanning the Farmers Union to the environmental advocates, and advocated for that through both houses, and it's currently still alive. It's going to go into conference committee. But this is one way in which I think as intermediaries, we can see what needs to happen next, build coalitions, and move that forward. I'm going to go back real quick to this idea. Everybody still with me? Okay. And this is very conceptual, but I think these ideas are important framing ideas. So I just want to suggest that what I think we have in the Upper Midwest and in this partnership between the Land Institute and the University of Minnesota is a regional innovation system. And those are defined, again, in the interrelated technologies, knowledge, and experiences that underlie new technology development and their launch into the world. And they're on the ways in which regional innovation systems result in positive externalities for all participants. We talk a lot about negative externalities, right? But this idea of decreasing transaction costs in that system and de-risking the innovation process as competitive advantages for regional economy. Like, I don't think Minnesota is probably long-term the best place to grow Kernza above all other places, but I do think it has a competitive advantage due to this regional innovation system. And you see some of the entities that are involved in that. I'm gonna do it on time, all right? Cool. Okay, move through this. So it turns out that as new technologies make progress in the world, people have friendly discussion and sometimes vociferous debate about what those innovations are even for. So here's a couple active ideas going on right now. Is what is Kernza for in society? A couple different ideas out there. They're not mutually exclusive by any means, but they do vary. I think I'm going to skip over that. And I'd like to spend a couple minutes here on talking about this framework of scaling readiness. Scaling readiness came out of some work at CGAR, is that how you pronounce it? Is that it? Yeah? That works on advancing agricultural innovations in mostly, air quotes, developing economies. And I'm very attracted to this framework because we often struggle to communicate. Tessa, you got something? Yeah, well, I think they're collaborating on it, yeah. What they do here is they look at a single core innovation and they expand the unit of analysis to what they call an innovation package, which is everything else that needs to happen in order to make that core innovation go, right? So they're looking at the entire system. And so here are a couple examples of things we actively see need to happen, whether it needs development or innovation. And we heard yesterday about modified harvesting equipment, right? We need markets for novel perennial grain crops. Be marketed differently. They need to be turned into ingredients and applications through George's lab. We need, turns out we need new governance models for perennial grains. Who knew? We need a number of other things like a social perennial vision that Aubrey has worked on and helped digest from our community. So all of these things need to be happening simultaneously. And scaling readiness is a framework that looks at both the readiness and use of that whole. And interestingly, I recognize your limiting principle here, used by these folks in the scaling readiness package to broaden out to the entire system, right? So they said if we're going to create a system in which to hold the perennial grain economy, that we need to understand where essentially the limiting factors are. And we can think about the readiness of that system by both how widely is it used, but also how ready is it for scaling. And then they go ahead to map that out through a simple visual that looks at the different components in that system in the innovation package and maps them out over time. And what they found is that the same innovation, say Kernza, could be ready to scale or not ready to scale in different ways in Minnesota than in Kansas versus in the West. And then we might be able to map that, understand it, identify limiting principles, work on those, because in each of these, the scaling readiness of these systems are constrained by the smallest factor. You see the ones down in the lower left? The whole system can't move forward, right? Because of principles. So I'm very attracted to the idea of using this framework as a way to assess the readiness of Kernza and other perennial grains to scale and to identify and articulate their innovation package and map this out and actually track it, because people often ask us to track all of this and we don't really have good ways to communicate it. So this process we have here that's underway, these niches are going through this commercialization process. These intermediaries, these folks like Tessa and I get involved. Seems like we're running in circles, but we're actually making things happen. We're exposing folks to more and more levels of risk in a strategic way, engaging these different stakeholders, navigating, the frictions in the system, facilitating discussion and debate around different ways these technologies could be used, and with any success, we're preparing them, getting them ready to scale. And that is what I believe our team is doing. I don't have a lot of time to share with you all the specific ways we've been doing that, but I did list out a number of what I think are key activities and functions that we've been performing for the last several years. I will allow you to read these as they proceed. We formalized our partnership. We work on IP, on variety releases, developing seed systems. We have set consistent standards for grower adoption. We vet and license all Kernza growers. The Land Institute manages the Identity Preserved and Trademark Program. We support grower and industry adoption. We build capacity for cross-sector collaboration. We provide annual semi-structured convening for everyone across the system that's trying to onboard. We develop and deal in good market information and technical resources. So the ones in green I have a brief profile on. We facilitate technical assistance to growers through a practical technical assistance team as we build a more robust system. Turns out growers have questions and they call us. They need answers. They're in their field, we broker opportunity. A couple other things we do. We innovate policy where we think it's needed. We develop pilot programs to de-risk Kernza production. We collaborate with policy experts to surmount these frictions. Turns out growers couldn't certify their acres because Kernza didn't exist, the USDA. So we got the USDA to recognize that Kernza exists. Well, intermediate wheatgrass exists as a crop. So on and on and on. These are various ways that our commercialization and stewardship team functions in the system. So I'll skip over this and just say, sort of a little vignette. Here's one little sliver of what we do as Tessa and I, and a wider team, set standards and priorities for onboarding Kernza growers. And we consistently vet and license all Kernza growers throughout the system. So 300 growers have applied to grow Kernza in the last, and we've talked to all of them, right? We've also since adapted some of those vetting and licensing guidelines relative to what was mentioned previously and, access concerns. And here's a little vignette in how we develop and deal in good market and technical information. And so the details of each of these little images is not what I'm asking you to zoom in and try to look at. It's just that all of this needs to be communicated rigorously, consistently, clear, and that's what our team tries to do. A couple other things I could say, but I think I'll just run to the end here. And I'm totally guessing there are important questions about what's the current state of Kernza and so on and so forth. We're happy to share that during the Q&A, but we want to reserve some of this time for dialogue. So thanks. And now Tessa is going to speak to the development of a Kernza Stewards Alliance. And I'm not sure if we know how to do that.
We'll see. Now you can probably push escape. Oh, I stopped the share, so I should have restarted. All right. Well, Colin talked about innovation packages, and I'm going to talk about one of the pieces of that innovation package that we're trying to work on. So as he alluded to, we are in this situation where what we're finding to be one of the limiting is governance around Kernza and how to get supply chain stakeholders in particular a unique way to communicate with one another, to be invested in this grain in ways thought of before. And I feel like what I'm going to talk about is both really innovative in sort of its legal structure and pretty common in its underlying philosophy. Commodity groups exist for all crops, and the goals of those are to help the supply chain advocate, communicate, and create really coherent stories that they need to the broader audience. And so I'm just going to tell you a little bit about what has been going on at the Kernza Stewards Alliance, which is what we have sort of named this commodity group, or what's modeled sort of on a traditional commodity group around Kernza. Stewards Alliance, I do want to say the funding to build this organization is through the Kernza cap that Jake talked about yesterday. So it's been very important piece of the work that the supply chain and economics group has been involved in. Many of the folks who are supply chain stakeholders here have been involved in that. So this is going to be new information for some of you, and information that others of you are really aware of. I would just want to talk about what is happening right now in Kernza. And Colin sort of talked about a lot of this. The Land Institute, we administer the trademark. So this means that we send documents to growers, they sign them, we send documents to distributors and handlers, and they sign documents and send them back to us. We audit, so we send out surveys to collect data from all of these folks. We maintain the identity preserve program that ensures what seed and which varieties are available to be grown as Kernza. So you can't like go buy a forage variety, harvest it, and say that it's Kernza. We administer an identity preserve program to make sure that these improved varieties, which hopefully the breeders yesterday made a good case for the importance of that, are used. So those are sort of administration, trademark administration activities that the Land Institute currently handles. We vet all of the growers, and we also make decisions around how many acres get put in the ground or how many acres we approve. Colin said we've talked to 300 growers, and that doesn't include all of the growers we talk to who decide not to apply and go forward. So it's probably double that. I'm thinking. The University of Minnesota also, so Colin vets some of those growers. I can't talk to 300 growers, and for growers that are in Minnesota, Colin talks to them. Now that the University of Minnesota has also added a technical assistance team, Carmen, Frank, and Nicole have also vetted growers for us and made recommendations about whether or not we should proceed with licensing those growers. So we really, we do rely heavily on partners to be able to make this happen. Yeah. Right now, there are 66 licensed Kernza growers, 15 CPG, 2 distributors, 2 and 1 handler. And some of those are the same folks. So folks often occupy more than one spot in the supply chain. For example, you might be a grower who also has a business that distributes Kernza, and maybe you decide that you want to go ahead and make a value-added CPG product. Then you might hold 3 licenses across the supply chain. And so that's another piece of the kind of trademark management, is making sure that people understand what the provisions of each of these kind of licenses is. There's also just a lot of legal background that gets done as well. You know, I talk with our trademark lawyers, our intellectual property lawyers a lot, making sure that the language around all of these things makes sense, and that, you know, I'm communicating it appropriately to the license holders. So the really good news about the way that things are now is that the University of Minnesota has a really strong relationship. And we formalize that relationship. So there is an MOU in place. Actually, it's not signed. It's not legally binding, but Connie, Colin, and I worked to develop it so that we are clear about how our relationships work. And in a way, this is sort of the basis for what we want to create for the entire supply chain, for the entire Kernza endeavor, is a really nice foundation to make sure that we all understand what our roles are, how we can communicate, what kinds of things we are required to communicate, and what kinds of things we can go ahead and make individual decisions on based on our own agency, right? So having this foundation is really important. I think it's been a really important piece of what we've learned getting these innovation packages to be ready to scale. And it's a good foundation for building trust, right? It's like, oh, but you said you'd do that. Okay, well, now I do that, and it makes sure that we can build trust on top of that foundation. The one thing that I think it is important to recognize is that right now the Land Institute has complete and unilateral control of the trademark. The Identity Preserve Program, we can make decisions about who gets licensed, what gets licensed, whose licenses are terminated, all of those kinds of things we can do at the Land Institute, and we wouldn't have to consult anyone about it. We wouldn't have to talk, you know, I mean, there are relationships that we would have to manage, but in a legal sense, we do have that kind of unilateral control. The long-term realization for my program, the Crop Stewardship Program at the Land Institute, is that really trademark management is sort of adjacent to the objectives and mission of the Land Institute as a whole. And so the trademark license is really geared at supply chain stakeholders. And so those stakeholders primarily being the licensees. And so having unilateral control of that as an NGO makes sense in some regards, because we are able to, in that sense, make sure we maintain the purpose of why we initially had the trademark. But there are pieces of it that maybe don't fit necessarily within the mission and might belong in a different organization and be more aligned there. So until now, however, there hasn't been like a clear purpose. So one of the has been that we've noticed is like people talk about the promise of Kernza, the vision, the But what does that mean? To every individual, you might, if you really dive into that, every individual might give you a different answer, right? If we ask Jess, she might talk about the nitrogen balance in the system. If we ask Jake, he might say something about water quality. What we want to do is really understand, for especially for licensees, for stakeholders, what is that shared vision and purpose, and what does it mean when we talk about that promise of Kernza? So we have been in the process doing strategic planning around a Kernza Stewards Alliance, which is essentially a business association that would include licensees as members of that association. And just to be clear, this association we've formalized, or it's not formalized yet. We're in the process of doing the strategic planning, and I'll talk about kind of where we are and what the next steps are, but we're envisioning it as a steward-owned organization, which is something different than the way most commodity organizations work, and is pretty unique to our knowledge and to the knowledge of the experts that we've consulted. This idea has never been done in this way before. So we're asking these questions about who should own this space, who should own the Kernza trademark, who should be able to participate. All of those things are questions of power. And we're in a situation where there are a lot of people taking a lot of risk. So thinking about how risk and power need to be connected. So if you're taking risk, should you have a say in how these things get rolled out? So making sure that licensees have a voice. And we also want to make sure that non-licensees, many of you in this room, researchers, folks who work for NGOs, things like that, but that have been really involved, also have a voice. It's really important that we're in a position to hear those ideas, because so many of you have been embedded in this work for so long that those ideas need also formalized and be part of this promise, the purpose of what moves things forward. Oops. Yeah. So I think and the other thing is growth. We want this to be ready to scale, and how we have to be putting these things together so that the goal here, right, is not for Kernza to remain a niche product that very few people have access to. The goal here is for this to scale. We need to make landscape scale change, thus we need growth. So what have we done so far? We've conducted 36 hours of direct stakeholder input. So many of you were interviewed, many of you were part of focus groups where we really got down to what is needed, and have some good ideas around the needs for this organization. And then we had strategic planning process that included people across the state or across the supply chain. Licensees from all different realms were invited to participate in different conversations around strategic planning. So right now we have a draft mission, vision, and values that needs to be adopted formally. We've spent a lot of time doing kind of background and education around steward ownership. And then we are currently in the process of developing these next 4 things, which are a governance model that really outlines, how that power is distributed, those kinds of things, a revenue model to make sure that this organization is going to need to have staff. How do we make sure that there's money to employ them? To figure out the legalities of how we establish the perpetual purpose trust. So kind of what that looks like here in a minute. And then ensuring that diversity and inclusion are written into this initially. This organization is primarily a white organization. It's primarily a male organization. That is true at this point. So the question that we're really grappling with is what can we do where we are? And how do we plant a flag to get to where we want to be? We want this thing to be clear. It's simple. You can tell me after this presentation if we're achieving that. And these are kind of all of the things that we're grappling with. We have to have, effective means of resolving power dynamics. A lot of this comes out of the work of Eleanor Ostrom around developing protected commons. So again, while this is sort of a new way of looking at that, it's also not coming out of nowhere. There's a theoretical and practical framework and examples for how these kinds of commons have been built and how we can move into ensuring that they're governed for the best outcomes for stakeholders. So this is kind of where we're at. As I just said, we're drafting a few documents already. We have the high-level organizational structure. And I just want to share with you the draft mission, vision, and purpose. So the mission that came out of the strategic planning with licensees is guiding and growing Kernza's future together. So this, I think really, to me, surprise. If any of you feel shocked by this mission, particularly for licensees. So this is from growers all the way through CPG manufacturers within the supply chain. This is the vision. And I think that growing piece, it makes a lot of sense. We continue to want to scale this. The vision is vibrant ecosystems, vital economies, and healthy people through perennial. Again, I think this is a really good example. Jess was talking about some of the things that we often don't think about in terms of ecosystem benefits. This, I think, gets at some of those other things, so that vital economy and healthy people. And then finally, thinking about what the perpetual purpose, what is the purpose of Kernza into the long term? And this is something that we want to get feedback from the researcher audience on, because that purpose is something that is sort of bigger than just the commodity scale group, right? It's just the licensees and stakeholders. So scaling Kernza perennial grain ensures stewards benefit from Kernza and steward resources that we steward resources responsibly. So this is something that you all will be getting. You will be getting invited to meetings to participate in picking this apart and coming up with clear language around this. So this is just draft. The values that we came up with, I'm just going to kind of run through quickly. Innovation, I think not surprisingly after Colin's talk. Equity, effectiveness, urgency, collaboration, and longevity were the values that came out of these stakeholder meetings. And then here is the organizational model that we're looking at. So the idea is that the KSA would sort of be a lot of this picture, but the license could be held by the LLC. And I do want to make it clear that the trademark ownership will not be transferred unless this is and making sense, and the board of the Land Institute has to approve any kind of transfer or sale of trademarks, so of intellectual property. So that's just to be clear that this is a vision that we have. Has not happened, and and we are in a process with this sort of as the flag to where we want to get to. An LLC that would own the trademark, the LLC is governed by what's called a perpetual purpose trust. That trust, a perpetual purpose trust, ensures that all activity that happens at the LLC level is in service of the purpose, and also ensures that the ownership can never transfer. So that's why it's perpetual. Licensees would have a voice in electing folks who both sat on the board of the LLC and on the perpetual purpose trust. And licensees and non-licensees could also have a voice in that. And the next question that we're really looking at answering is figuring out how do we organize non-licensees, researchers, others in such a way that we can, that they can have input in this kind of structure. So what's needed? We need to get the governance and decision-making, bylaws, things like that sorted. We've got to form some legal entities. We've got to think about transferring intellectual property and how the audits and things like that are going to be maintained and managed, and then think about communication and marketing. Then finalizing, so the goal is by spring to kind of finalize business plans and governance documents, to look at stakeholders, review and refine drafts through summer of 2022, and then look at filing legal documents and drafts in sort of toward the end of the year. And that is where we're at. So that's all I've got. And now, I don't know.
We got time for questions. If
Yeah.
there's.
Everyone gets it.
Thank you both for your presentation. I have a question, I guess, for you both. First, for Tessa, Ostrom's core principles talk a lot about monitoring, sanctions, and then, swift conflict resolution. If the commonly held thing is Kernza's future, what does monitoring and sanctions look like?
Yeah, a lot of that, the sort of the beauty of having the trademark is that a lot of that can be built right into the trademark licensing and licensing program. So currently the monitoring and sanctions looks like if you don't fill out the survey, we can pull your trademark license because you didn't comply with the IP program. If you try and sell grain in a way that isn't, so right now, the licenses specify that if you're going to sell grain, you have to sell it to a licensed buyer. That. So if you don't do that, we can pull your trademark license. That's sort of how the sanctioning goes. And again, it's very unilateral. And it also helps draw that boundary around what is the commonly held good in this system. And so we're able to draw that boundary really clearly because anything sort of that happens outside of the trade name is outside of the boundary. So does that answer your question?
It does, thank
Okay.
you. And then I guess for both of you, Colin, you talked about a lot about intermediation. How is this perhaps a case study of disintermediation or knowing how to let go?
A case study of what again?
Disintermediation, like when it's getting too
Disintermediation?
crowded in that space, and knowing
Yeah.
when, your child, to draw from your analogy that you're
Yeah.
stewarding, is ready to be, out in the world.
How do you know when it's ready?
Or just like, is this helping you understand what that process looks like, the KSA?
Yeah, I mean, we talk about it as a growth process that ideally you don't hold on to something forever. You send it into the world to grow and do good, and I don't think that's necessarily what I specifically am doing. I think collectively we're developing alternatives and offering them to society to solve big problems, right? And so I just think of it as like the next iteration of creating a more accountable and inclusive structure, because right now it's not. And like if you asked us any given day whether we want to be deciding who does and doesn't grow Kernza, like we don't think that's good for this realm. But at that time, somebody needed to fill that role because the alternative of just having no one decide or just replicating all the structures of the institutional dynamics we heard earlier is problematic. So setting some common standards and structure around like a scaling pathway that's informed by everyone, I think important. And yeah, ideally we disintermediate when we create alternatives that are viable and move on to the next challenge, right? So we always have blind spots in our systems, and I'm sure Kernza has them too. And I just wanted to mention briefly the last question. Something I didn't have time to get into is actually how much time we spend playing defense, right? Like we always promote like there's a new Kernza product, but Tessa could tell you a lot of stories about like going back to Ostrom's ideas, like there are bad actors hope for the best, plan for the worst, and oftentimes bad things happen. And so we've had to put out a lot of fires on a regular basis, some of them larger than others. And
Yeah.
so yeah, that often happens in the existing structure of the last few years, is that kind of regulatory kind of thing in the interest of a perennial grain economy, like people that wanted to sell Kerns as an annual and just capitalize on all the work people were doing to create a perennial grain system. But anyways, other questions?
Yeah. So it's very impressive, and I'm really excited about what you outline about the perpetual trust and everything. And at the same time, I'm uncomfortable about, I see the need of it as a strategy, about the perpetual nature of it and the idea of taking a food crop and saying it is always going to be managed by an organization. So can you comment on that?
Yeah, well, I think there are a couple of things. I think one of the things is that what's managed by the organization is the trade name. Right, not necessarily the genetics or other things. So I think that is the only boundary that there is currently. And I think that's important to recognize. So recognizing Kernza as a trade name is really important, because what do we have to offer that does make people want to be a part of this particular movement is that we're trying to do things a little differently. We're trying innovative things, we're employing intermediaries to help support new entrepreneurs and risk takers and things like that. And we're working really hard to be able to do that. So there are benefits, I think, and to being involved, but at any time there are going to likely be people who don't want to be involved but could still be involved in perennial grain.
Yeah, and then I was going to say trade names can be dissolved and a trust can be dissolved. It's just that so long as that trust and wants to continue existing, it's a protective feature to prevent overtaking by people who have tried to say, I'll participate, but only if you give me unilateral control. We've been asked that about 10 times, right? So this is a protective structure to actually create an inclusive commons, rather than if we had no guardrails whatsoever. It's sort of like, what happens to commons when really big and bad actors come into play, right? So that's kind of what we're trying to create. And then I was going to say that this is, in the grand scheme of things, we talk about iterating different models for perennial grains and their market development strategy, go-to-market strategy, whatever it might be. And this is one among many, and we'll be able to see how it works relative to like perennial rice and perennial wheat. Maybe those just move forward as commodity alternatives that have, that are just marketed as rice. And a bonus feature is perennial, right? And we'll be able to see how those play out. And I think we need to iterate those models and then reflect, is this thing with Kernza working, or should we do something else?